Hi there, this is Matt Heffernan. Welcome back to my channel. This is number 26 in our slithy vlog series, so a little informal chat on things that I have going on. And this week it's another update on one of my games that I'm working on, and it's a web-based game called Movopoly. And if you're not familiar with that, if you haven't seen the previous videos, please go back to the playlist. There's the Evolution of Movopoly playlist, and you can see from the very beginning what the concept of the game is, and especially last week's vlog episode where I started to go into a bit more of what the concept is behind it and how I'm going about developing it, including using a lamp stack for this web development. So in this vlog, we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly LAMP is, why is it popular, and how we can let LAMP show the way towards creating a fairly nice game using a full stack web implementation. All right, let's get right into it. First of all, the L in LAMP is for Linux. Now, chances are you're on my channel, you know what Linux is, or maybe you think you know what Linux is. The reality is it's technically GNU Linux, and that's because Linux itself is just the kernel. It's a low-level part of the operating system. It's not a complete operating system. It just provides that really basic control over how resources are used by the computer, how you access, devices and things like that. And that part of Linux was created by Linus Torvalds, of course, the namesake of Linux. And that went all the way back to 1991, where he wanted to create an open source operating system, but mainly he was just starting with the kernel because there was a lot of open source stuff already by the early 90s, but there was no really good modern operating system that was fully open source yet at that point. And so that's what he did. He went ahead and did that. But he couldn't really just install Linux on a computer and then do anything useful with it. But the good news is going back to 1983, there is the GNU user environment, which was created by Richard Stallman back in 1983. Now, you may know a little bit about Linus Torvalds and some of his eccentricities. Well, he doesn't quite hold a candle to Richard Stallman. He is the original free software graybeard, and he is very adamant about making sure that as much software as possible is free and open source. And he is, of course, runs the Free Software Foundation. And it's out of this movement that GNU was created. And GNU is a recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's not Linux, Unix. Sorry, it's not Linux either, but it's part of Linux. So GNU's not Unix, because Unix, of course, is the basis of all of this. Linux and GNU together are trying to basically replace this proprietary operating system, Unix, which was developed by AT&T Bell Labs way back in the 70s. And it is still in fairly common use today, and probably most popularly in the a Mac operating system is a variant of Unix. And of course is, for the most part, closed source, commercial. You've got to pay Apple, not just for their computer, but for the special operating system and the license for running the operating system on that specific hardware. But Linux, it's free. It's totally free for anybody, at least most of the distributions, and starting all the way back by the end of 1991, somebody was already taking the Linux kernel and combining it with a bunch of GNU software to create a usable operating system. And of course, those initial ones were just text-based. And so now these were just being distributed. This was like the early days of the internet. This is really before the World Wide Web as we know it today. And we're talking about Usenet groups. That would have been the main way of disseminating this information. You wouldn't have a website. You'd post a message on a news group saying, hey, I've got this thing, and here you can come download it from my FTP server. You didn't have GitHub or any of that stuff. But, of course, speaking of GitHub, Linus Torvalds, in addition to creating Linux, is also the creator of Git. So even if you're not a Linux user, you are still reaping the benefits of Linus Torvalds. If you're doing pretty much any software development these days, Git is almost completely taken over the version control market for software development. And we can see also here, though, on this slide, we have the family tree of Linux and sort of the three main families of Linux, the Slackware, Debian, and Red Hat. They've all go back to about 1993 for Slackware and Debian, and 94 going into 95 is when Red Hat came on the scene, and then every version of Linux, except for these little stragglers you see at the bottom, are all coming out of those first three distributions. And the important thing about those distributions is that they combined not just GNU with the Linux kernel to create this GNU Linux operating system. They included windowing systems like GNOME, which is also out of the GNU project, or KDE, which I happen to use, and all these other different environments, and all these distributions, or distros for short, have all these different peculiarities and different ways of doing things. But at the heart, they're all using the Linux kernel. New versions are taking new versions of the Linux kernel as Torvalds and his team are releasing those, and that propagates throughout the tree. And in fact, and new versions of GNU software, including the GNU compilers like GCC. That's getting distributed through all these. And the GNU environment even goes beyond Linux. If you have any Unix system, including a Mac, or if you're running something like Cygwin or MinGW or something like that on Windows, you still have access to all this GNU software, and you can still run it. And you can run within a GNU environment on all these different systems. But the only one where it's totally free for everybody is Linux, or at least most versions of Linux. Some of these branches of the family tree, they're charging you for it. But if you want to run Linux, you have an almost limitless selection of free options for that. So that leads us to, well, now that we have Linux installed, how do we turn my Linux machine, whether it's anything from a Raspberry Pi to this gigantic enterprise server, how do I make that offer up web pages? Well, you need to have a daemon running, a DAEMON, daemon running that will respond to HTTP requests, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And the primary one for that is Apache, because A is for Apache, and the Apache HTTP server, or HTTPD, HTTP Hypertext Transfer Protocol daemon, which was originally released in 1995. And of course, the web had already started really taking off before then, because before that, the main one was NCSA, the National Computer of course, it's blanking for me right now. The National Center for Supercomputing, something at the University of Illinois. They were the guys, and all these guys ended up eventually founding Netscape. And the one guy in there, named Rob McCool, he developed that initial HTTP server for NCSA while he was there at the University of Illinois as an undergraduate. And that means that he was this kid that didn't even have a bachelor's degree, and he created the first really big software standard for web development, or for at least for the server side of web development. And in 1995, he branched out and made an open source, free and open source version called Apache, which pretty much the NCSA version of HTTPD completely disappeared at that point. And pretty much everybody used Apache until more closed source commercial versions of things came out from folks like Microsoft and Sun/Oracle and everybody trying to create something that you can really just get for free. And the beautiful part about Apache is it's offering up this HTTP service, and it provides the Common Gateway Interface, or CGI, not computer graphics. I mean, what you're doing is when a document is requested from your HTTP server, that if it's not an actual document, it could be a program. And that program could be written in literally any language, and it would just allow a remote client to execute something locally on your machine, given that they're providing all the information that you require for that to happen. Obviously, you don't want your machine starting to smoke because some kid keeps pinging your system. But, it's basically how the web works, is that it's not just offering up documents. Most websites have some sort of backend that is doing a lot of the figuring out of what this person wants to see and maintaining access to some sort of common data repository. And of course, the main way of doing that is through a database management system. And for LAMP, that means M is for MySQL. And of course, MySQL is a relational database management system, and it was founded by a company that also called itself MySQL, that came out of Sweden in 1995. And all they did was create this free and open source database program that uses the SQL query language, which had become an industry standard by then. And of course, you had companies like Oracle and Sybase that had these extremely expensive database systems that would use SQL for querying them. But they realized, SQL itself is not a proprietary thing. We can create a free and open source version of that. And the only way they found to make money actually doing that as free software was, of course, by selling out to Sun Microsystems in 2008. And as we probably all know, they were subsequently bought out by Oracle. So now Oracle owns everything that Sun had. And ironically, they have big, expensive Oracle database. And they also have free little MySQL. And generally, even though it's completely corporate owned, it's still free and open source for the most part. So you can get a special build or a special license of MySQL and pay Oracle an actual license fee for that, and it may include some proprietary closed sourced software along with that. But for everybody else, at least for the time being, we can still get the latest and greatest MySQL as free and open source software. But not everybody trusts that that will continue. And so these days, a lot of folks are transitioning from MySQL to MariaDB. And so that's what the M can also stand for. And MariaDB is just a fork. They forked it back in 2009 off the original MySQL in that time period when Sun had bought it and it already became a corporate-owned thing. And the impending reality of Oracle buying Sun was getting people really nervous. Like, well, Oracle buys Sun, MySQL is going to go away. Let's fork it while it's still open source. And so that's what MariaDB did, and they are by far the most successful fork of MySQL. But I think there should be a word of caution still regarding MariaDB, is that even though it's not owned by Oracle, the money for developing it is coming from somewhere, and namely that's Intel and Alibaba. So some very big companies with lots of money, deep pockets, they want MariaDB to succeed because they don't like giving money to Oracle any more than anybody else. So they are funding MariaDB. So it's still free and open source, but there could always be strings attached when you're talking about these like huge, gigantic companies. Anyway, it doesn't really matter which database you use. The fact is that you have an SQL database that is, easy to run on the back end, something that's free and open source, and that you can access simply from your web application, that the Apache web server or whatever open source web server you're using is able to access that database. Well, how's it going to actually do that? Well, we talked earlier about CGI, how the Apache web server can talk to and run applications that are running on your server. And the big way to do that in the LAMP stack is with PHP. So the P can stand for PHP, and that's primarily what it's been. And PHP goes back again to 1995 with a language that was called Personal Homepage, made by Rasmus Lerdorf, and yet another Scandinavian. These Scandinavians, they love nothing more than creating open source web frameworks. So that's our hats off to them for making all this possible. So old Rasmus here, he was writing C code to create these CGI backends, so creating a compiled program that could then run and do some text processing and spit out some HTML for a web page, for an active web page. And that is not the greatest system, because you got to go through the compilation, and C is not particularly good at text processing. It's not really made to do that. You have to, and we're talking, of course, about like 90s C, before you had like these C++ standard libraries for all these dynamic strings and everything. It's a bit difficult. So he created PHP just like, well, I need to have a quick way of just being able to do some simple processing on the back end and spit out some HTML. And he managed to do that, and now it's evolved into something that's no longer called Personal Homepage because some fairly large websites are using it. It is like GNU, a recursive acronym, and it stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. And it's really a pretty nice little language when you get down to it. It's very C-like, but it doesn't have to be compiled. It's sort of just-in-time compiled, and offers up a very nice way of dealing with strings and associative arrays, and then being able to connect to databases, and it has things like a MySQL interface built into it. So you don't have to go searching down a whole lot of different plugins for it. The basic PHP has a lot of that for it. And that's thanks, again, to a bit of corporate help. But in this case, it's a fairly small, not too scary company called Zend. And they are the primary sponsors of PHP. And so they've developed an engine that executes these PHP scripts, and then they have some other software that they're actually making some of that money on, that's going towards the sponsorship. But, if you don't like PHP, you don't have to use PHP, and it's still considered LAMP. In fact, even before PHP, a lot of those first CGI scripts, rather than using compiled C programs, well, they used Perl, of course. So P could stand for Perl, and increasingly these days, it can stand for Python. And Python can do pretty much anything PHP does and more, and some people prefer coding in Python to PHP. But PHP is really custom built for this back-end CGI work. So it really makes sense that it's a worthwhile thing to learn how to program in, because it really does make it very simple. And unlike Python, you're not going to have to be chasing down a bunch of dependencies to make anything work. That it's just going to work out of the box pretty much, especially if you're doing a LAMP type application. So we can see here in all these, in 1995, that really is the banner year for this open source web technology. It's like by 1995, and now they're talking that's 27 years ago. All of these different components came together, and you could do a total head to tail web application entirely with open source software. It's really quite amazing. So, I mean, why did all this happen to converge in 1995? I know we hear a lot about how the World Wide Web goes back to 1990. Well, sort of. It wasn't really a thing at that point. And by 1993, there were still only 130 websites, and people were using text-based browsers like Lynx to access them, and there just wasn't a whole lot going on. The internet, and I am old enough that I was an internet user at this point, that the web was just not a thing. It was like a cute experimental thing, and it wasn't really any more popular than Gopher. In fact, Gopher was a lot more popular, and of course, Usenet was huge. Usenet was where most people were spending most of their time getting and sharing information on the internet in a public forum, rather than, of course, private email and then IRQ chat rooms that are mostly ephemeral. But in terms of putting something out there, it was a Usenet news group. But in January of 1993, NCSA, those just a bunch of kids at the University of Illinois, they released Mosaic, which was the first really successful graphical web browser. And it just revolutionized everything. All of a sudden, using the internet became not just cool for nerds, but just cool in general and accessible to pretty much anybody. Granted that you were running a machine that had Mosaic, and for me personally, that was a Sun Spark station at my university's computer lab. It wasn't even available yet for a PC or a Mac or anything. But that started changing pretty quickly, because by 1994, that World Wide Web got up to 2,738. I can't vouch completely for these numbers. This is something that I've found, but it just about tracks that in 1994. That's when Mosaic really became widely installed on a lot of different systems, mainly at universities and other researchy type places, and you start seeing more and more stuff. And that's when I really started using the web in 1994, and just sort of poking around. There wasn't a whole lot to look at on the web, even with these thousands of websites. Most of them are just nonsense. Nothing's really changed. We just have a lot more nonsense, but a lot more interesting things too. And but then by that December, those folks from Illinois pulled together and decided to make themselves into a company called Netscape, and they released the first version of the Netscape Navigator web browser. And that's really when things started taking off, because that was being targeted for home PCs and business PCs and Macs, so that then your personal computer would have a graphical web browser. And boy, oh boy, did that really start taking off. By 95, it was jumping up to over 23,000 websites. And the sort of janky system you had to pull together to make a PC or a Macintosh be able to get on the web, this was not something that either of those systems were designed to do. But we saw within the industry that this is where things are going. People are going to want to get online more and more. So Microsoft made Windows 95 and a little application on there called Internet Explorer that came shipped originally back in August of 1995, when the web was really starting to take off. And now you had a new version of Windows where getting online and having a TCP/IP stack and going to websites was a built-in functionality of that operating system, and that's something that people were just going to do on their computers. Now, it didn't mean everybody started using Internet Explorer immediately. Netscape was still dominant for a while because Internet Explorer, you think it was bad by version 11. Oh boy, version 1 was not good. It was not a usable program. But Internet Explorer did improve, and at some point, Netscape stopped improving, and Internet Explorer took over, especially by the time Windows 98 came out, and these newer, more useful versions of Internet Explorer were still getting shipped with it. And you probably know the history by that point. And yeah, so things eventually started to get towards where we are today. But all the way back in 1995, when people were firing up Windows 95 for the first time, they were going to be able to access websites that were already running a LAMP stack. So is LAMP retro? I think it kind of is, but it still is vital. It's still alive. It's still something that you can do with a modern application. Of course, there's other frameworks that completely abandon the whole LAMP concept, like mean, which I'll probably cover in another video. And but the thing is that LAMP still works really great, and especially for the application that I've chosen to make, which is a fun little game. So let's take a look here at how the LAMP stack manifests on our Linux system. So basically, Apache will just run as a standard Linux service. And what it's going to do is say, okay, I'm getting a HTTP request on my port that I am listening to. Primarily port 80 is where those requests come in. And what it's going to do is like, if I get a request on port 80, I'm going to serve up something from this directory here, var www html. And if I take a look at that, you'll see I have index.html, and then I got a bunch of other things here. And if I show how they're linked, I've got Movopoly. It's actually going to my workspace. So this is the Git workspace that I have. I'm pulling and pushing right from there with GitHub. And so basically, as I'm writing this application, everything is already immediately accessible on being served up from the workstation, which is simply a laptop that is able to serve up this website to anybody that is connected to my home Wi-Fi, which of course is the whole concept of the game. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So here is my index.html. Of course, it renders like this. But first, let me do a little cat of index.html. Dead simple little web page here. It's got a little CSS, so things look kind of okay. And this is based on what Apache sort of creates for you by default. And I just made it look like my own in-house internet page. And I put some of the jQuery demos on there because, as you'll again see, I have jQuery UI and jQuery mobile. So the jQuery UI demos are accessible just by going through the jQuery UI subdirectory. And that's what we'd be able to see right here. But Movopoly is also a top-level subdirectory for my website. So I click on that, and there we go. I get the opening page. And, of course, I have a cookie that remembers who I am. Now, if I open up a incognito tab and I go right to that Movopoly page, being an incognito tab, it's not going to have any of those cookies left behind. So I'm going to have to give this guy another name, and we'll call him Bubba. I like to call these extra guys Bubba. So Bubba's going to ask, hey, do you want to play a game? Bubba could start a new game, but Over here on this other device, I'll say that Matt's going to start a game. And I'm going to call it, I'll call it Slithy Game. Why not? So I click start on that, and there it is. Slithy Game is started. You can see here it pops up in the title bar, and I'm now in the waiting room. And I can see here I can't start the game yet because I'm the only player, and you got to have at least 2 players. And then over here in Bubba, now Slithy Game pops up over here, and I can click join. And now we got 2 people in the waiting room, and we could continue to wait for additional players. But I'm satisfied here with just me and Bubba. We can play a game of Movopoly ourselves, and so I click start, and we both get pushed into the game proper, and now I get the chance to roll first, and we're both at the go space, which is the bedroom of 2 of my daughters. So there you go, and you can see you start out with $250, and here I can see I'm the current player. And then Bubba sees, Matt's playing right now, but you're next, and here's where you are, and you're just waiting for your turn. And I don't have a whole lot of the game developed beyond this, but that's basically how it goes. Is that I'm able to serve up everything just by having my workspace being connected through the Apache, just by using the basic Linux file system here, saying by, hey, Movopoly's pointed over here, and just by virtue of having that in this directory, everything can be served up. So then here in my HTML, I developed this as a single page application. So I only have a single HTML document for the whole game. And just like different parts of it will appear at different times. And it also includes this a bunch of JavaScript, including jQuery and jQuery UI as this sort of front-end framework for being able to more easily develop these applications. And then, of course, a special JavaScript program that is called Movopoly.js. But anyway, we can see down here, there's not a whole lot of of HTML. Pretty much everything is in JavaScript and PHP at this point. So the JavaScript is still also all in one big thing. So it includes this JavaScript in the HTML. And we can see here when we want to do a new game, it's going to do an HTTP post to something called newgame.php, and it's going to pass some data, including the name of the game and some identifying information. So the cookie that got created when I said, hey, here's my name, and it creates it puts the name in as a cookie, and it also generates a hash code as a unique identifier for whoever's using that device. And so then when I do that post to newgame.php, it actually goes and says, all right, when I'm retrieving a PHP file, rather than like a HTML or JavaScript file, or even like our CSS style sheet, which is also getting included in there, this is not just going to give you this text. This text doesn't actually make it to the client. This is what gets executed on the back end. And what it's doing on the back end is connecting to a MySQL database. And then it's going to connect to that, and then it's going to run an SQL query first. It's going to make sure that, hey, that there's nothing in our games table of the same name, because that's got to be a unique identifier. And if it's not there, then it goes ahead and inserts that, and it says, here's the game, and it's going to be the name that I put in, which was Slithy Game, and then originator is going to be the hash for that Matt user is going to go in there. And so that's how it basically starts the game, including doing a bunch of other things. And then there's other scripts that do all the different handshaking between the different users, and just initializing that game in the database, so that then when I get in here into MySQL and I use a MySQL workbench for being able to take a look at what's happening with the database. If I do a query now on the games table, we can see that slithy game is in there. And on the players table, I can see that, yes, we have Matt and we have Bubba, and they're playing slithy games. But say I got bored with playing with Bubba, and I could just go ahead and refresh this. And it's like, yep, that's still my name. Oh, do I want to go back to playing slithy game? No, I'm going to start another game. And I'm going to call it Super Bad. I was watching that movie not so long ago, but now we can see here that I've started a new game, and I'm going to wait for somebody, maybe somebody other than Bubba, to show up and play with me. And now if I look in games, I'm going to see Super Bad in there. It hasn't started yet, so that's null. And then in the players, if I take a look at that state, now we see two Matts in here. The Matt that's playing slithy game and playing Super Bad, but you'll notice they both have the same hash because it's the same user. They're on the same device, and they're just one game is in the middle of playing, and I could always go back to that. And in fact, here I can go back and just refresh and say, welcome back. Yep, my name's still Matt. I could go back to waiting for somebody else to join Super Bad, or I can go back to playing with Bubba, and it's still my turn. Bubba's still waiting for me to roll that die. And if I roll the die, I show up in the dining room, and hey, look, the dining room's for sale. So eventually this will be filled out with the ability to purchase it, and then do all the basic Movopoly stuff. But in the game, of course, I am physically walking from that bedroom to the dining room. And yeah, it should be pretty fun, and it's been fun making the game. So we'll see some more of this as I go through the process of building it. And if you want to learn more about how some of this web development works, I can go as deep as you'd like to see into some of this code. So just let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think that it's like pointless to still use a lamp stack in 2022, that I should be using something even newer? Or do you think that this is a bit too extreme, and I should be creating some, like, who knows, an assembly language program that uses raw sockets or something? Who knows? Whatever you think is the best way to create a really retro game like Monopoly and make it work as a mobile application, because that's the main thing. It's got to be mobile, because you can't have Movopoly without the mobility to make it happen. That's it. That's all I got for you on this episode. Now it's time to just go ahead and load up the Patreon page. And again, give my most sincere thanks to the folks that are supporting my channel and really helping it get better, hopefully with every video and every bit of support and feedback that I get from these wonderful people. And if you want to be one of them and be able to see all of my content before it gets released to the public, just go ahead and hit me up on Patreon and join our community and really have a chance to contribute, not just financially, but just culturally and personally to the content that I'm putting out there, both the videos and the games that I'm creating. And anyway, if you don't want to give me money, that's fine. You really do a whole lot for me by supporting me on YouTube, by subscribing to the channel and clicking that bell to be notified when those videos do go public, and of course liking the video and commenting and giving me that feedback there. And all that rolls into allowing me the chance to be able to create more and better content and create these retro games anew for people to use on new retro computers, on old computers, or even on the web. So that's what I'm trying to do, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.